Good evening, folks. I'm Larissa Vigu-Picard, Director of Pejepscot History Center, and glad to be here with you this evening. We may have a few additional folks who pop in for this program, Crimes Against Genealogy, which is a fun title, and I know is going to be a very interesting topic. One, because it sounds like a lot of fun, and two, because I know Barbara Desmarais and she's always delivers. She's done wonderful programs for us of many kinds over the years. She's been heavily involved in the Historical Society and the history of the three towns we serve, Brunswick, Topsham, and Harpswell, of the whole region. And she's contributed some incredible research to our understanding of the region of Maine and our place in the country. One of perhaps the most important things that Barb's done in the past, well, two very important things. One is she has worked a lot over the years on Black history in Maine, and in particular in Brunswick, and contributed quite a bit of research and knowledge to our understanding of folks who have been living in our area and were living in our area for many, many years and generations, and sort of brought those stories back to the forefront. And the other thing I want to point out is that she has done amazing research about all the cemeteries and the people buried in them in Brunswick. Many of you have probably been on walking tours with Barbara. She does a number of them for us most summers, of different cemeteries in the area, and they're always very lively and get incredible feedback. So we're very excited to have her here to deliver one of our last programs of the year tonight on genealogy and the kind of surprises one might find doing that kind of research. Before I hand it over to Barb, I just want to mention a couple of things. Appreciate if you keep yourselves on mute tonight during the talk. We will at the end have some time for Q&A if you have questions. You can also put some comments or questions in the chat box at the bottom during the program, and Barb can answer those at the end. And then I just want to mention to everybody that we have a Zoom coming up in November, the second Thursday in November, which I'm totally blanking on the date right now. I apologize. And also at 6 p.m. And it is with Susanna Ashton, who has written a book about John Andrew Jackson, the man that was harbored in the Stowe House by Harriet Beecher Stowe for one night, and that she gleaned a lot of information from her experience with him for the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Susanna Ashton will be with us in November on Zoom, and that is on our website now, so you can register for that. Our Halloween Murder Mystery Weekend is actually all sold out, so I won't try to sell you on attending that because we have sold 120 tickets. It is fully sold out. But our member holiday party and Santa Day will be happening on December 7th. So stay tuned for more information about that. And we'd love to see you there. I guess without further ado, I'll turn it over to Barbara, and she'll share her screen and take us back into some family trees.
So hopefully you can all see that okay. So thank you, Larissa. I'm Barb Desmarais. I like answers. I don't really care what the answer is. I just want to have one. Some people don't like the real answer, and maybe they make things up. We're calling those things tonight genealogical crimes. I'm going to start with an underground Railroad story in 1850 here in Brunswick. You can see this is a map of Brunswick Village from 1846. You'll see I've indicated the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her husband, Professor Calvin Stowe, which is on Federal Street. I've also indicated just down from that the home of Phoebe Upham, her best friend, and Phoebe's husband, Professor Thomas Upham. That's the Elks Club on Park Row. Down towards the bottom right, you can see the Smythe Packard house. That's on College Street. It is now the Russworm Center. Smythe was an abolitionist, and down below their house, you see the cabin of Phoebe Jacobs, who was formerly enslaved and in 1850 was a free woman, and she passed away before this story. So in 1850, some of these Brunswick residents aided formerly enslaved John Andrew Jackson to his freedom in Canada, and that's wonderful. However, too often, to me, the tales of the Underground Railroad are told from the points of view of the white folk who were helpers along the way. So I'm not sharing that story with you, and it sounds like you will be hearing that next month anyway. So what I'm sharing is an Underground Railroad story conducted by the African American community in Brunswick and Bath. It was a free African American community here. We'll meet Francis Houston. You can see his farm there. He was an African American sailor who came to Maine from Massachusetts around 1800. He married Mehitable Griffin, who was the granddaughter of a formerly enslaved couple who also came to Maine from Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War. When Mehitable's first husband, a sailor named William Swain, died, she married Francis. So the left side of the screen shows the 22-acre farm of Francis and Mehitable Houston, and that's now part of Bay Bridge Estates on Old Bath Road. And you see that yellow brick road going over to Bath. That is the Old Bath Road. You cross the New Meadows River and it becomes the Old Brunswick Road going to Bath. That is where the Bath and Brunswick African American community settled, right along there. And Francis and Mehitable had a great deal to do with that community, either helping people who had freed themselves to settle down there, helping sailors who wanted to come here, because if you were a free African American and a sailor, man, you could get work anytime you wanted. So they might come into Bath and then they would meet the Houstons and they might settle down in that neighborhood. And the Houstons, and before them the Swains and the Hill family and all of the families here, like any family in those days, had plenty of children. And of course, this community married among themselves. And the African American communities, like the white communities, followed the rivers. So in 1850, two other communities were a little bit bigger than this combined community of Brunswick and Bath, Portland and Bangor. Then there was Augusta, which was kind of close to the Bath, Brunswick, like 55 people. But all those towns are on rivers, which makes perfect sense. Now you see that road goes to in-town Bath near the courthouse. If you were to follow that road from Bath to the left over west to the Houston farm, that would be the same route that Clara Batiste took on a late summer night, in the middle of the night, after everyone in her household had gone to bed. She was the enslaved nanny of the Tupper family who were in Bath visiting their kin here in Maine. There was a great connection between the Southern plantation owners and the ship captains and their families here in Maine, because the cotton trade depended on all of these people. It depended mostly on the enslaved people, obviously, but I mean the families, the ship captains' families, and the plantation owners' families knew one another and married one another. And so where to go on a hot summer from Georgia? Maine. And that's what happened. This Tupper family brought Clara up here with them to be the nanny to the children. And I'm sure she was their nanny back in Georgia too. But when she left that home, there was a waiting hack. It was driven by John McDonald, an African-American who lived just on the Bath side across New Meadows River on the old Brunswick Road. This community all knew one another. There's no way that Clara Baptiste was there all summer and didn't get to meet John McDonald, some of the Houston family, others around here. I mean, I don't think we understand how close these communities were in those days. Everybody knew each other. The whites knew the blacks knew the whites. This is not a separate history. It's the same history. So McDonald took Clara to the Houston farm where she was sheltered. The Georgia family returned home the next day because they had no choice. School was starting or whatever. It was time to go back. But they sent agents back here to bring back Clara. And I'm really pleased to say that no Brunswick or Bath resident, black or white, ever gave her up. Now, I should have turned this soon. No, that's the right one. Okay. Novice here. So I was able to do some proving of this story thanks to the internet. This Bath census, August 1850, showed the Tupper family in downtown Bath and Clara Burtson instead of Baptiste, but it's Clara Burtson, 24, female, mulatto, Georgia. Now there's a story there. There's no Black woman born in Georgia in Maine at that time. I know because I've looked at all the records. The following month, not even a month later, in the Brunswick census in September 1850, we see Mary Scott, 28, the age doesn't really matter, female, Black, Georgia, in the home of Francis and Mehitable Houston. Now, you know that's a story. And Mary stayed there. A year later, in 1851, Mehitable died. A year after that, Frances Houston, and now naming herself Mary Dunlap, went to Boston where they were married. It was in the Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston. And that was the beginning of the genealogical crimes against Frances Houston. And we'll uncover them by trying to answer 3 questions. And here's the first. How many children did Frances Houston have? Can you see that with the thing on the side? I can move over to the left. Would that be helpful to you guys? Do you think?
What
Is
are you?
some of it covered?
No, we can see the whole slide.
There, so you can see both of the records.
Both of the records. It's just
Okay,
that you
cool.
probably can't on your screen, but we can.
Pretty close, pretty close. Yeah. Okay, that's great, that's great. So on the left, in Brunswick Vital Records, it's a book I have, but I've also seen the records at the town clerk's office. You can see that Francis and Mehitable had 8 children from 1808 to 1826. You see on the other side, you see Frank Houston, that's Francis, and Mary Dunlap had 6 children. So how many children did Francis have? He had 4 with Mary. And the reason I say that, you look at this, Emma Houston, born October 1850. Mary was already pregnant with her eldest child, Emma, when she reached the Houston home in 1850. So Francis could not have been Emma's father. And although, if you look at this, you see Sophia at the end, I know from research, and we'll get back to that, that Francis also did not father her. Nevertheless, so we can say Francis fathered 12 children, 8 with Mehitabel and 4 with Mary. We'll continue with that. There are so many numbers in his story that I think we need to break it up. And don't stress about the numbers. I'll read them. I'll do the math. You can feel my shame and we'll be fine. So we're going to first do Flora's story. This is Flora Purrington. She was my grandmother. This is her sometime in the early 1900s here in Brunswick. And Purrington was her married name. When I'd ask my mother and her siblings what her, for more information about Graham, they were really vague. Oh, I think her parents were named Silvar, maybe Silver. I think they were from San Francisco. Mother never really talked much about how she and her sister Alice got here. So I wanted to know, what was Flora Purrington's maiden name? So, in 1986, this was before the internet really, and before cell phones. It wasn't unusual for a niece to write her aunt letters. My aunt, you have to understand, lived in Portland, but still, it wasn't that unusual. I mean, we didn't travel to one another's places that often. So after my daughter was born, I started writing her letters to ask about the family history because my mother's eldest sister, Alice, never married. She lived with my grandmother Flora's younger sister, Alice. Oh, we love to repeat names, Alice Kelly. And she never married. So I figured between the two of them, they would have more information. So I asked her about what she called my Gram. I never actually, Grammy died hospitalized when I was only 6. I never actually met her except for when I was in my christening gowns. I never really knew her, but I'll call her Gram because that's what everyone else called her. So she says, your Gram was orphaned here. Her parents were J. Antonio Silvar Pestruit and Maria Nicarda Pestruit. They were Portuguese immigrants. I already knew that. The girl's mother brought them east by train. Seems she sold their house. Ma spoke of their mother sewing gold pieces in a sort of belt around her waist. The girls were placed in a home on Huntington Avenue, Boston, then called by the awful name of Home for Destitute Children. So when I asked Aunt Alice how the girls, Flora and Alice, got to Brunswick from Boston, she expanded a little bit. She said the little ones were conveyed to the parish churches and lined up at the altar rail. And I've heard this story before, not just in this context. So any Catholic family in good standing who would undertake the task of rearing the child, feeding them, housing them, making sure they were raised as good Catholics, could choose one of these children. Very often, they would choose a child to help with the household tasks or to help with the farm tasks. Everyone was a farmer in those days, that you grew your own food. So she says that at St. John the Baptist Church, that was the only Catholic church in Brunswick at the time, that Grammy Leonard took Mama. Sometimes they called her Mother, Mama. They called her all different things. And Aunt Alice Kelly was in the group that wound up at Holy Cross in South Portland, and she was taken by Grammy Kelly, who was supposed to get a boy to help with the chores. And she told her husband, well, there weren't any boys to choose from. Obviously, this woman wanted a girl. And really, that's how my grandmother Flora was chosen, was because she was a girl. The Leonards had all boys. And so my grandmother was the daughter. She was never adopted like Great Aunt Alice was, but she was cherished. And that is not something that always happens. So now I had another place to look to see what Flora's maiden name was. So this was before the internet. I made phone calls. I wrote letters. I did all kinds of research to contact the Roman Catholic Diocese in Boston to find where these records of the Catholic Children's Home were. And so that's when I discovered that Great Aunt Alice Kelly had actually tried to find out some of this stuff in 1930. You can see this and I can't. All right. So this is a letter from the Westboro State Hospital, Westboro, Massachusetts. That is a mental hospital, to the Home for Destitute Catholic Children in Boston. And this is a letter that later I found a copy of in my Great Aunt Alice Kelly's papers after she passed and after her niece Alice passed, and a lot of the stuff came to me. So it talks about how their mother, Mary Silva, was admitted to that hospital in 1902 and was discharged in April for deportation back to Portugal. Now, the reason for that was that she was divorced, she was mentally ill, she did not have a job, she was not a citizen. This was in the days of nationalism. This was in the days when we're not going to pay for these immigrants or anybody who's not a citizen that is not contributing. So she was sent away by ship back across the Atlantic, and Flora and Alice were sent to the children's home. So it does tell me that she came to the US, my great-grandmother, Mary, at the age of 18, that she married and had 6 children, all of whom were in California. The sad thing is, the reason I never talked to my own grandmother, Mary's eldest daughter, Flora, was because she too was in a hospital at that time, in the Augusta Mental Hospital at that time. There seems to be a genetic predisposition to dementia in my family, in a direct female line. So this is the kind of thing everybody would like to know in their families. But it was a vascular dementia. So if you have high blood pressure and hardening of the arteries, all that stuff, that's when you need to worry. But still, here's another clue, and it's still before the internet, really. I mean, you can learn about a few things. You can do email, but there aren't all these websites. But I was working at the time. I wasn't retired. So I hired a genealogist who specialized in Portuguese genealogy, and he found Mary and her daughters, Florence, they put, instead of Flora, and Alice in Santa Cruz, California. So that was really news to me. So then I wrote to the Catholic Diocese of Santa Cruz, California, or that area. Oh my. This is what they sent me for Flora, my grandmother. This is a birth certificate dated, the record was dated 1930. 30 from when my great aunt Alice asked about it. And it's Flora Silvershoot, child of Anthony Silvershoot and Maria Miranda. It's not Nacarta. It's not Silvar. It's okay. So what kind of Portuguese name was Silvershoot? I don't know. But then there was even newer technology. I'm so excited. I mean, you have no clue. Why is this not? Oh, okay. Ancestry.com. Okay, I have to admit it. It's things like this. They had censuses online. I found Flora M. Leonard. I mean, I knew she was adopted by the Leonards. And this is her in 1910 on the same street I still live on, by the way. Actually, this 7 years later, okay, in 1917, this is my grandfather, Charles Purrington, and this is Flora Leonard. They were married that year. So that means there's a marriage record. And here it is. Flora M.S. Leonard. All righty. So is the S for Silvershoot? Silva? Silvar? I don't know. And what happened to Pestruit, that one that my aunt had written? Well, now this is even newer technology, okay? I'm in heaven because it's DNA, all right? I matched a man named Bill Pichotto, and that's only been in the last maybe 3 years, okay? I didn't even know how to pronounce this. Friends had to tell me how to pronounce it. And he told me that they had a little different story than we did, that they knew that Antone and Mary were divorced and that he took his wife's name. And I don't know if he means his second wife because Antone Silva did remarry, took the wife Bachotto because Silva was such a common name in Santa Cruz. Well, it was. And so was Antone Silva. In fact, at that time of all this happening in the early 1900s, there was an Antone Silva who was an attorney who was accused of cheating somebody out of their inheritance. But Mary and Antone's son, Willie Silva, was also arrested for kiting checks. So that might have been another reason. So there are lots of reasons for changing your name. But what you might not know is that Portuguese families are really hard to research because of the common names in certain areas. They'll take any name that appears in their family. It might be their third great grandmother's surname. So it's really hard to trace. It really is. But it made me think that on this Flora Silvershoot, maybe it's obvious it was filled by Reverend Farrelly, and that reminds me of Farrell, which sounds like it might be Irish. So he didn't know from Portuguese. So maybe Silva Pachotto became Silvershoot to him. That's the best I can do. But here's the thing. Flora May Silva, just like a month ago, I found my Uncle David's birth record, and she reported her name as Flora May Silva. So now I know what she considered her maiden name. And you know, that picture I showed you of my grandparents was one that kind of came down to me because as people died, and as was this one, they kept giving the albums to someone younger. And now it's come to my generation. And now I have this. It's in one of the albums. There's no name. I don't know if this is my great grandmother, but I think it is because I really feel she wants her story told. The crime here is that no one wrote a name on the back of this photo. I really don't know if this is my great grandmother, the one who was deported. I like to think it was, but we may never know. I'm going to take a breath because you see how excited I get. I can't help it. I love this stuff. I love your family as much as I love mine, but Now we're going back to my friend Francis Houston. I love him. I think that family is just amazing. I want to know, when did Francis Houston die? And I'm bringing this up for two reasons. I have a friend named Bob Green, whose family, they're African American, has been in Maine for generations, probably since colonial times. That I can't say. But he was researching the Houstons, and we were working together on a lot of things. And he was confused. He said, I see all these Francis Houstons. Did he name all his sons and grandsons Francis Houston? I mean, there's so many dates. And so we realized that there was a real issue here. Now, that oral record that I told you about that shows 6 children for Frank and Mary, right, showed that Frank Houston died June 1st, 1867, right? But I've seen his tombstone just a week or so ago, and it says June 1, 1858. The Brunswick Telegraph in June 1858 published 2 different obituaries for Francis, and they also say he died in 1858. My conclusion is he died in 1858. And of course, I've told you how that happened. It's because these were oral records. The town clerk, Jonathan Forsyth, realized that they were missing a lot of records in Brunswick, particularly the rural records. So he and his assistant went door to door to get records from families, particularly the rural families. And a lot of people would have Bibles and they would give exact information, but others might see this as a blessing, as a real opportunity. I find it that Mary, in one fell swoop, legitimized her eldest and her youngest daughter, who were neither of which were fathered by Francis Houston, but at least it gave them a place in society. This was in the 1800s. This was an amazing thing. And what a smart woman to do that. I find that amazing. Because Sophia, you see, was born in 1861, 3 years after Francis Houston died. We still have one more question for him, but we're going to go to it happened in 1916. So a lot of you know that in 1999, I was part of the Brunswick's Open Space Task Force. And I volunteered like a fool to survey Brunswick cemeteries, not knowing that between single grave sites on old farms and all the family farm cemeteries, we have over 40 burying grounds. I'm still finding things. But in McCoy's cemetery, I found this, and you might notice that the surname on this is Purrington. It's Purrington with a G. So I knew this has something to do with my family, although my mother always said they didn't have any cousins. They weren't like we French Canadians. We have cousins. We don't care what generation you are. You're our cousin. They didn't look at it that way. I mean, so this is some distant cousin here of my mother. But the thing is, what caught my attention was there were 5 deaths in 1916 on this one tombstone. And I had to wonder what was going on. So now I had the internet. I looked up, I found death dates. I found that some of these weren't right, but that there really were 5 who died in 1916. They weren't always the ones that were listed, but there were 5 in 1916. But all in all, between the dates of 1914 and 1919, 10 people in the same family died. 10 people. And I thought at first, 1916, oh, it's a flu, but that was too early for the flu. So as time went by, I did a little more research. I was able to find Hiram's death certificate, as well as others. And he died of pulmonary tuberculosis, TB, which was pretty common in crowded and poor conditions. These were not rich people, and it was a big family. They did indeed live in crowded conditions. So I have to think that maybe it was Hiram's parents, Charles and Mary, who years later had scraped up enough money maybe to put up this headstone in McCoy Cemetery and honor their descendants. I don't know who put it up, but I'm just glad it's there so that we can know this family was here. And if you want to know more details or see some more photos, I have a blog, Cemeteries of Brunswick, Maine, at WordPress. You can just Google that. It'll come up on the search box in the upper right. Just type 1916, it'll come up. Someone much younger than me is helping me create an index for a chronological index of these things as to when they happen, because I just find an interesting story, research it, and publish it. So they're all over the place. But that's where you can go. You can find all kinds of other stories, although I have only one about Francis Mehitable because that story is way too big for that blog. So our final question for the genealogical crimes against Francis Houston: how old was he when he died? So his tombstone says 95. The obituaries say 94. I got to thinking, now I'm dyslexic, so I read upside down and I read, 9, 6, a lowercase, B, D, Q, P, they're all the same thing to me. So I could see a typesetter making an honest mistake, and maybe Francis was born in 1764 and not 1794. That would have made him 94 in 1858. It would have all worked. But that was my crime. I liked that story because it fit, because the obituary said 94, the tombstone said 95, and I was assuming that the tombstone was put there right after Francis died. But what if it was later on and it was just a vague memory of that obituary that was used for the information on that tombstone? And they put 95 instead of 94 because that's what they remembered. So what if it was the birth date that was reversed? These 9s and 6s again. What if instead of 1764, he was really born in 1794, and it was his age that was reversed? He wasn't 94, he was 64. Oh, I loved my story, but you have to admit this is a real possibility. I have no idea. But wait, there's more incredibly annoying information. There are census records, and the early census records had people in a range. So in 1820, Francis was 45 or over. 1830, he was still 45 or over. So we'll say 55 and over. 1840, 65 and over. 1850, well, then they listed a number. It says he was 68. But according to the census records, he should be 75 and older. His marriage record to Mary Dunlap says he was, in 1852, age 70. Yeah. Then a couple years ago, I saw an out-of-date ad from an antiques company for a family sampler made from Mehitable Griffin's family. It had her first husband, William Swain, his date of birth and death, and all their children. And it had Francis. It had his birth date, but the last date on there was 1829, which was Francis Mehitable's 19-year-old daughter, Pamelia, who died then. There was no date after that. So it doesn't have Francis's death date, but it says he was born 1778. So I guess maybe we take the family sampler and say he was born 1778. And we're pretty sure the obituary and tombstone say he died in 1858. That would have been age 80. So given all this information, I am confident that when Francis Houston died, June 1st, 1858, he was between the ages of 70 and 95. And that's the best I've got. So now, if you still want a little bit more, here's another of my ancestors, I think. Alistair Coombs, an Englishman, or maybe Alistair Coombs, a Scotsman. We'll see. All I do know, this book you're looking at is taken from the York County deeds from early on, and it's typing out of those handwritten deeds. And there's a land grant for Alistair Coombs at New Meadows, which is East Brunswick, where we've seen Francis Houston. And it's in 1675. And there were 4 Indigenous leaders who made their mark on that, and also Thomas Stevens, who owned a lot of land on the Pejepscot River, which is really we call the Androscoggin, but that part from Main Street Falls down to the bay, they called the Pejepscot. Try reading that with 2 T's, Pejepscot River. So what kind of tickles me is on the left, that's from a book on early genealogy, really. And it shows that red is outlining Alistair Coombs' lot, and it goes to the New Meadows River. So that's why I don't have any line underneath it. But you can see if you look at the Houston farm that Alistair's lot, which was much bigger, definitely takes the Houston farm. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, but it just pleases me that my ancestor was also on that same spot. So the thing is, that's the only time I've seen Alistair Coombs. I've seen Anthony Coombs in a lot of records. And family lore on the internet, and we know no one ever lies on the internet, says that Anthony Coombs was saved by his wonderful mother who sold her jewels to buy him passage on a ship from France to America. So this Huguenot, this Protestant, would not have to live his life as a priest. Really? Maybe. But DNA, which you all know I love, there was a study because a lot of people knew that something wasn't right in the story. And so the male Coombs line, a lot of people participated in this DNA study. And it turns out that my Anthony Coombs, and maybe it's also Alistair Coombs, maybe they're the same person, is really Antoine Comeau, whose parents were immigrants from France who went to Acadia, specifically to Port Royale, which is now part of Nova Scotia. And Pierre Comeau, Antoine's father, was a cooper. And that was a really big deal in those days when you had to make containers to carry things. And this was a port city. So it was a really big deal. That port city was a gathering place for Indigenous people, French settlers, French trappers, French soldiers and sailors, English soldiers and sailors and traders, as long as there wasn't a war going on, or even if there was, if they could get away with it, Dutch sailors and traders, Portuguese traders and sailors. They all congregated in that one place. Now, I don't know why the family felt that this was a story to tell. Maybe it's because they lived in a place of Protestants. They really, even in Brunswick, they didn't deny that they were French. Although that Alistair Coombs thing does seem to be a denial, but maybe that was just what someone called him. But Antoine Como came here in the company of Louis Alain, who was a blacksmith, and he apprenticed to Louis Allen, as he was known here in Maine. But when Allen went back up to Port Royale, Antoine stayed here. This is a 1741 plan of Pejepska, courtesy of the Pejepska History Center. Is actually in Wheeler's History of Brunswick, Topsham, and Hartswell. And I'm showing you this so that you can see, I don't know if you can see this. This up here, you'll see. This is Topsham. This is the Androscoggin, and below is Brunswick. Now, I'm going to turn this a quarter turn in a second, because so this is the area we've been down here. This is where Francis Houston was. This is a lot of the area that Alistair Coombs owned. If you look at, this is more of a close-up, but you can't read it even if it's upright. So I turned it sideways so you could see more of that area. All these stars are Coombs's. Anthony, Peter, George, they're all related. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stars, 10 100-acre lots in 1741 were owned by the Coombs family. Yet there really aren't deeds from the Pejepska proprietors. So it leads me to believe that these Coombs, whether they're the sons of Alistair or just kin, used that land grant as the basis for their claims. And I just like that because it gives me a connection here. And if Anthony was not Alistair, then my earliest ancestor here was Lieutenant Peter Coombs, who was at Fort Andros, Fort George, which is on this more or less where Fort Andros is now. And he owned a lot here in 1730. So that's a long time for this family to be in here. So I just really hope that whatever you find in your own family stories, whether it's good, bad, or nonsensical, you just enjoy the journey, because we didn't make this history. We're the product of this history. And it's up to us to put it in context and to just enjoy the journey. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and send it back to Larissa and see what happens next. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Barb. I appreciate that. I
Thank
love you. I just love listening to you tell a story, tell more than one story. Just really wonderful. You've done some incredible work over the years on your family, and obviously on a lot of other families in the area. And I'm happy to have anybody unmute themselves and ask a question. I wanted to actually just start with, you talked about, most of what you talked about were probably mistakes or so-called crimes of accident, perhaps. And in some cases, not so much crimes, but changing a date in order to, give somebody legitimacy as a child, give somebody a more legal parent. Have you come across in any of the research that you've done on anybody's family things that are more sort of nefarious in terms of people altering the record for agendas. Or, maybe somebody else on here tonight has come across.
Well, I mean, this is so in Wheeler's history, families could submit their personal histories. The Dunning family submitted one saying there were two parts of the family from these two different places in England, and that they were descendants of this Lord Ashburton, I think was his name, and that he had left, I think it was like 50 million, it says dollars, I don't know if it was pounds or whatever, and an estate, and was looking for the male heir, in England they were looking for it. Well, the Dunnings were Ulster Scots who came here in 1717 from Northern Ireland, number one. So I have found that a lot of families did change their origins in order to fit in here. Then there are others that are prideful. If anyone's read my blogs, you know that I've written about things that happened at Norwich Walk, when actually someone in my family tree and others from this area massacred the indigenous settlers there. And Richard Jakes was a soldier who didn't listen well. He was very hot-headed. And he disobeyed orders, and he shot Father Sebastian Rael, the one who was preaching to the indigenous people there, and that caused all kinds of problems because it made him a martyr, and his commanding officers were just incensed. I mean, it's like one was his father-in-law. The Jakes family turned this story around to make Richard Jakes the hero of the story. Then years later, we talk about Port Royale. I learned about Port Royale because of battles that took place at Louisburg later on between we down here in Maine and Massachusetts and the Acadians and indigenous partners that they had up at Fort Louisburg. And the family said that he was mortally or grievously wounded there, but came back home to Harpswell, and it was there he either died or was killed by marauding Indians. Well, two officers, now that their diaries are online, specifically said he was killed at the battle at Vert. There's no burial spot for him here that anyone has ever found. He is somewhere up there. But one family member was selling this book online about these stories about Richard Jakes. But then after, I like to think it was because of my blog, but I'm sure it wasn't. But not too long ago, that was no longer for sale online. So to me, this was prideful on the Jakes family, and I am by marriage related in a very distant way to that family. So that's why I'm picking on them. I figure if they're mine, I can do that. The Dunnings, I think that I think it was a scam. Like, how you get something that says, oh, I'm the personal representative of so-and-so, and they have left you this money. You send me $100 and I'll send you how to get it. And I think that's what this kind of thing was. I think it was some kind of scam on the Dunning family itself. the fact that they called themselves English at that time may not have been a way to become English. The Ulster Scots and English families that were all here in 1717, they intermarried so many times that they may have lost their history. I mean, it's not like there were a lot of paper records. On the other hand, it's the victors that write history. So if you're living in a community where it's the English who are the leaders and the ones who hold all the offices and all that, maybe you want to be them. And if it's the Protestants that are the ones who are leading everything, maybe you want to be one, especially if you're Catholic, because in the 1920s and 30s, they were, I talked to you about nationalism. They were targeting my Catholic people, and they were targeting the African American families who are still here, but there were a lot more of us Catholics, so we were much easier targets. We were very prolific, and we took over. So, yeah, that's all I can say.
Well, it's so fascinating because it's like in many of these stories that you told tonight, the work is almost never done. I mean, you get to a point where you can say, I think I can say that this person was, born in this time and died here and is probably about this age. But the wonderful thing about the sampler is that is a pure primary source, as opposed to a census record which is we consider a primary source, right? But it's somebody who is recording something that somebody else is telling them, or
That's
that they're.
right.
So I just want to invite anybody, if anybody has a question, would like to pop on their screen and ask a question. I'm happy to do that. If not, we can certainly wrap it up. This is being recorded and will be sent out to everybody who registered tonight, which was, we had a large group actually who registered, and so there may have been some folks who couldn't be on tonight, but you're welcome to share that recording with others, and I'm sure that if you find that you have a question about any of the stories that Barb talked about tonight, or in fact about the process of doing your family history, doing genealogy, and running into roadblocks or walls where you can't figure out how to get through, please send them our way, and I'll share them with Barb because she's got a lot of experience in this area.
Well,
So,
and I love a story.
and I do encourage everybody to check her blog out because there's some amazing stuff in there. It's just a lot of history of our region that is collected in there. Thank you so much, Barbara, and we will send this recording out soon. And thanks everybody else for attending. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.